Hey there, bird class. How's everyone doing this afternoon? I see a lot of you guys have been working on coloring the images. Good. Yay, so many people saying good afternoon. All right. So I've got a couple of announcements to start off the class. So I'm going to have to clear the drawings. Okay. This week we've got a quiz and short answer questions as usual that are due Sunday before midnight. And we have about 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks until the project requests are due. You can submit those in the content area about the projects on Blackboard. If you get a grade of 2, everything's fine. If you get a grade of 1, look for my comments because I'll have something that I wanted to say. Yeah, Mary, go ahead.
Hi, I was wondering, I didn't get a grade for that yet. I just figured that you just didn't do them yet, but because I had submitted mine like right at the first week, the first week of class.
Okay, I will double check that because I thought I was up to date on those.
Yeah, I think I was probably the first one that put in a request.
Okay, I will
Okay.
double check that.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, yeah, spring break is coming up, March 14th through 18th. So the important stuff, not that this isn't important, but you've heard this part before. What you haven't heard before is this. Next Tuesday, instead of lecture, I'm going to ask you to watch a video online. It's called Parrot Confidential. There's going to be a link on Blackboard. The link will be up. I can get the link up this afternoon. And there's going to be what I'm calling a quick quiz on the material in the video to confirm that you watched it. And the material in this video will be included on the quiz and the assignment for next week. So you have to watch this video. When we meet next Thursday, March 10th, we're going to be talking about parrots and we're going to be discussing this video. It is I find it an emotionally intense video to watch. So be aware that there's a lot of information in it that might be disturbing, but it's important. If you're going into the pet business in any way, shape, or form, I think this is something that you guys need to know about. Any questions on this? It's probably one of the 2 most important things we'll talk about this semester. All right, if there aren't any questions, we have been talking about breeding. And we've kind of touched on the ethical discussion about breeding. Should people be breeding birds? Well, it's a tough decision to make. If we're allowing birds as pets, we have to think about where the birds are coming from. And of course, having captive breeding reduces takes from the wild, reduces the number of wild birds that are captured for the pet trade. Let's face it, the illegal pet trade is a huge business, but people are not capturing budgies from the wild and smuggling them to the United States to sell them in the pet trade because there's so many budgies and they're so cheap. They are capturing parrots and macaws and that sort of thing and smuggling those into the US. Captive raised birds do better in captivity than wild caught. Animals that are raised around people get much more comfortable being around people. And if you're raised in a house, you're going to get a lot more used to being in that small of an environment than if you were raised out there in the wild where you could fly for miles. So if we're going to have a species in captivity, captive breeding is definitely the way to go. But should the species be bred? So we've already talked about budgies and how there are so many excess budgies, right? Lots are end up in animal shelters. We're going to watch the video on parrots next week. Parrot rescues fill up almost as quickly as they open. And they're usually overwhelmed. So should you be adding to the parrot overpopulation issue? I used to include parrot rescue groups in the discussion on parrots as pets. And I found that basically I can't keep up with the turnover in the rescue groups. Generally speaking, a group shows up, they've got space for 100, 200 birds, they fill up, and then they're overwhelmed and they kind of just become a sanctuary and quit accepting more pets. So that is just became impossible for me to keep up with existing parrot rescue groups because they don't last long. One relatively clear situation for breeding are endangered species. We breed endangered species for release to supplement the wild population, to preserve genetic diversity in captivity, and for captive populations in places like zoos. So when we talk about breeding endangered species, there are several endangered species that exist today only because of captive breeding efforts. So the whooping crane, it's a Native American bird that was knocked down to under 25 individual birds. Those 25 were taken into captivity. They were bred. They bred them very carefully to maximize the genetic diversity, to maintain the genetics represented in those individual birds. And now they're in the wild again. There are several hundred of them in the wild. We've got a similar story with the California condor. We're still working on the alala or the Hawaiian crow. We've got a captive bred population. We're trying to get them released back into the wild in Hawaii. So that is important work, and I strongly support that. One of the things you have to learn, though, is how to raise babies. You don't want to learn how to raise baby birds if you're working with the species, on a species there are only like 20 people or 20 birds. How much of that is because we killed the population to begin with? Yes, Danielle, you got it. All of those birds species, it was because the population got that low because of people. Yeah. The whooping cranes were killed for their feathers. The California condors, primarily that was lead poisoning. People use lead bullets to hunt with. And condors are carrion eaters. They'll eat whatever the hunter doesn't take out of the woods. And they were eating the bullets and getting lead poisoning. I honestly don't know what happened with the alala, but I am quite confident that it was people that did that. Now, I know there is controversy over the ethics of keeping animals in zoos. Have you guys talked about this? I think you have to take an ethics class. Do you talk about zoo animals in that class? Not much. Okay. Do you guys have opinions on it? Faith, you got your hand up? Go ahead.
Yeah, so what I've come to accept over the years is that although a zoo may not be the ideal place for many animals to live, many animals that wouldn't otherwise be living where they were if they weren't in zoos. I definitely think that the efforts of zoos to maintain healthy captive populations is essential, because if they don't, then there would be practically no hope to preserve these species if their populations in the wild, I'm in class. Sorry. So it's essential to maintain a healthy captive population in the event that the wild population becomes functionally extinct. And many species that are being bred in zoos are already functionally extinct in the wild. That's how critically endangered they are. And so what I know a lot of zoos do here in the US is they will breed native species. They'll breed species that are native to the Americas in captivity. They try to minimize as much contact as they can. They'll usually cover their faces with masks, or what I've seen done with condor chicks, they'll feed them using a hand puppet. They sometimes use a hand puppet of a condor to feed the chicks. so that they don't imprint on their keepers. And then once they're ready to, once, you know, they're healthy and mature enough to go out on their own, they release them into a net, they release them into a protected habitat.
Mhm.
But with the animals that aren't able to, be released, I feel that a safe I feel that a safe and protected existence combined with careful attention from the keepers, support from guests, and also plenty of enrichment designed specifically to get them to perform their natural behaviors. The most ideal, like, a zoo will never be an ideal environment for every animal, but
Yeah.
they
You-
do the best that they can, you know. Exhibits are designed to mimic natural habitats as much as possible, and the most reputable zoos will incorporate feeding enrichment and target training and all that good stuff. And
yeah, you've
mostly,
obviously given this a lot of thought.
and the most important part of zoos for me personally is education, teaching people the importance of the species that they get to see. Because if you don't get to see an animal up close and observe the way that they interact, you're never really going to care about what happens to it ultimately.
Whole bunch of really good points there. Thank you for that. Mary, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in the ethics and law class, what it basically was about was the laws, basically on dogs and cats and permits and licenses and stuff like that.
Okay.
That's what we basically focused on.
Okay. Well, I think Faith made a lot of really, really good points and things that I have thought about. So I agree with her on a lot of those points. And I have felt conflicted about zoos. Part of me is like, I enjoy going to zoos and seeing the animals. And part of me is like, but is it the right thing to do to keep animals in captivity? So it depends on it really depends on the zoo. Good zoos put a lot of time and effort into taking care of the mental and physical well-being of their animals. There are unfortunately a lot of really crappy zoos that don't put that amount of care into their animals. There are some animals that do very, very well in zoos. I have no problem seeing lions in zoo situations most of the time. In the wild lions sleep for 22, 23 hours a day. So they're lazy. They won't move around much if they're getting all the food they need. So they do well. I hate seeing other types of animals in the zoo. Generally speaking, the very small hawks, broadwing hawks, Cooper's hawks, sharp-shinned hawks, and the small cats, I don't like seeing them in zoos. They don't do well. They tend to be very highly stressed. I do not believe in, as Chelsea pointed out, forced interactions with humans. Voluntary interactions, I'm okay with. Forced ones, not so much. If you go to a zoo and they have get your picture taken with this baby animal, that is a red flag. Because a lot of those places are breeding, usually lions and tigers, for the picture taking opportunity. Well, you can only take pictures with them when they're little, and then they grow up. And in a few months, what do you do with them? So, and yeah, why are those animals in the zoo? That's always a good question as well. There's not one answer that applies to every species and every zoo. I do think there is a place for zoos. I agree with the idea that if you don't ever get the opportunity to see animals up close, you know, you go out in the wild, your chance of seeing a wolf or a bear is very, very, very thin, very small. Your chances of seeing a lion, if you never go to Africa, very, very small. So why would you care about them? I think that's an important role. I think captive breeding to help sustain populations that are in massive decline because of the things humans are doing, I think that's an important role. But yeah, they're not always taken care of as well as I would like. So, and some animals, you know, in my opinion, and we're heading this way with some animals like elephants. The AZA is working to have a couple of zoos that have very large enclosures that have elephants, and that's it. So a lot of zoos in the past have had like 2 or 3 elephants in a relatively small enclosure. They need a huge enclosure and they need interaction. So for example, the North Carolina Zoo has oh gosh, how big is that? I want to say 100 acres. I may be wrong. I may be off base, but I think they have a 100-acre enclosure specifically for elephants. And that's, you know, if you've got captive elephants, that's good. Yeah, taking elephants to fairs, that's no good. That's really no good. One of the things that I did when I was trying to figure out my opinion on zoos was I volunteered at a zoo. And I worked with the animal care staff for over a year. And it really helped me refine my opinion on things to what it is now. Camels, a lot of camels are domesticated. So while we think of them as exotic, they're domesticated just like horses are. Yeah, pony rides at the fair aren't great either. So I suspect camel rides are not that great. And camels will put a serious hurting on you. Let me tell you. I've seen a picture of one that literally bit a guy in the shoulder and threw him. They're very powerful animals. That said, they're domestic and some of them like to work. So that kind of gives you my viewpoint on zoos, which is complicated. And I can see in the comments, there's a lot of complicated opinions. Yeah, animals do sometimes go mentally ill from captivity. If you see an animal pacing back and forth, either it's feeding time and they're excited, or they're mentally ill. Sometimes they do attack their keepers. This has been particularly true with elephants. Elephants have been known to basically lose it. The orcas at SeaWorld that attack their trainers, yep. On the other side of that, a lot of, I've been to a place that had dolphins, and the location of this place was coastal, and their enclosures were built in such a way that during hurricanes, they would open up the enclosures and the dolphins could go out into the ocean. And the dolphins would generally come back. So, you have to think about that. Yeah. Pet animals. Oh my God. There are so many animals that should never be pets. This is a bird class. I'm going with parrots, as you guys will see when you watch that Parrot Confidential video. Primates, no. Exotic cats, no. Even the friendlier exotic cats like servals, I don't like to see those in captivity. Yeah, I don't blame you, Mary. It's not going to be an easy video for you guys to watch. Anybody else want to talk about zoo ethics? I'm not an ethics professor, but I think it's good to have these conversations and to think about these things. Faith, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
So I remember I saw an episode of The Zoo. It's a show on Animal Planet about the Bronx Zoo.
Mm-hmm.
And in one episode, they mentioned a sea lion named Clyde. And Clyde came to the zoo because he was considered a nuisance animal.
Mm-hmm.
So he was blocking. He was causing trouble for fishing boats. Yes, he was causing trouble for fishing boats in the canal. And what happens to nuisance animals? Oftentimes they get euthanized. And so
Yes.
to prevent that, the zoo took him in.
Yes.
And now he is their main breeding bull. So now he gets to introduce his wild genes into an otherwise captive gene pool.
Yes.
And so nuisance animals can find some form of sanctuary in zoos if that lifestyle suits them, which
Yes.
for Clyde, that lifestyle does suit Clyde because he's a big ladies' man. He's a big stud.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of seals and sea lions in captivity are either they were nuisance animals like Clyde. I'd heard about him. He was also, one of the big problems was not just the fishing, but he was eating large numbers of salmon that were trying to get into the rivers to spawn, and the particular location he was in, he and a couple of others were really cutting down the population of this endangered salmon. So it was partly because of fishing and partly because he was a threat to this other endangered species. A lot of seals and sea lions that end up in captivity are failed rescue animals. So out in California, there's a group that picks up orphaned seals and sea lions off the beach, or takes in seals and sea lions that should have been left alone on the beach that somebody picked up, and they raise them up and they release them. Sometimes those animals, despite all the precautions this group takes, sometimes they just become too friendly with people, or they are released and then they end up on the beach looking way too thin. They weren't able to survive on their own. And so those animals end up in captivity. A lot of bears that end up in captivity were orphans. Sometimes they were orphaned cubs of nuisance females that were killed because they wouldn't quit breaking into people's houses or getting in their trash cans, and they were perceived as a threat. Some species, like there were recently some mountain lion cubs found in the city of Thousand Oaks. This whole group of mountain lion cubs and Fish and Wildlife were hoping that mom would come back, but mom didn't come back. And the babies were like under a picnic table somewhere. And so they finally had to pick them up because they were in decline. We can't raise bears and mountain lions and train them what they need to do to survive. We simply can't do that. So they're going to be in a zoo somewhere. Thousand Oaks, while it is definitely a good-sized city, it is right up next to the Santa Monica Mountains on one side, and the Santa Monica Mountains is a huge area of protected state, federal, and indigenous lands that has, I think, 160 some mountain lions in it. And on the other side of Thousand Oaks, there's also serious mountainous country that has mountain lions and various national, state, and otherwise parks. So it's not deep city. It's a city in between wilderness areas. Have you heard about the giant bridge they're building out near LA for a wildlife crossing? That's going to cross the 101 highway at one end of Thousand Oaks. And it's a giant bridge that's supposed to allow movement of mountain lions in particular, but also deer and coyotes and whatnot, so they don't get hit on the highway, and so they can mix genes up. And it's so popular with the people, they're now talking about building a second one at the other side of Thousand Oaks, so that we have even more places for wild animals to cross that major highway out here. Boy, did I get off topic. Okay. So, yeah, these wildlife bridges have been used in Canada for a while, and they're very, very successful. The one that is under construction right now near Thousand Oaks is going to be the biggest one ever built. It's going to be fantastic for the Santa Monica Mountains wildlife, which is largely surrounded by cities. Okay. If you haven't taken a screenshot yet, now's a good time, because I'm going to clear this off and we're going to move on. Okay. So you've decided to breed. Maybe you're breeding with a zoo or conservation organization and you're breeding to release in the wild. Maybe you're breeding lovebirds for the pet trade so that they're not taken from captivity. You got a lot of questions to ask. Are they male and female? I can look at this picture of lovebirds. I cannot tell you if this is a male and a female, two males or two females. You cannot tell by looking at these birds. Some species will be a little more obvious during the breeding season based on behaviors, but outside of breeding season, you pretty much have to get genetic testing done where you take a feather and send it off to find out. In captive well, even in the wild, a pair of male birds or a pair of female birds may act like a male-female pair. Behavior is not a guarantee of the sexes. Are these birds monogamous? Do you need to keep the same male and female together, or do they tend to switch mates between breeding seasons? Birds that mate for life, they're kind of like people. Sometimes they get divorced. Sometimes they cheat. Biologists call this extra pair copulations. You know, they're just like people. These extra pair copulations are very, very common in wild birds. Generally speaking, if you find a nest of baby birds and you've got mom and dad taking care of them, mom's probably the mother of all of those, but there's probably multiple fathers involved. Even though he's helping to raise them all, some of them are probably his, but you know, some of his are probably in other nests nearby. What is the point of saying they could mate for life if they can divorce? Thank you, Fiona. It is the phrase mate for life, the concept that birds mate for life is an old idea that came out of religious backgrounds trying to encourage monogamy in people. How bizarre is that? And yes, until we were able to do genetics, the cheating part, we really didn't know until pretty recently. But I mean, if you have a mated pair of birds and something happens to one of them and the other one kind of witnesses it, they will hang around the body of their mate. And so I think some of this idea that birds mate for life was related to that. The idea that, you know, they're mourning their mate, and of course it's this romantic idea that they'll never mate with anybody else, but that doesn't make sense biologically. I recently found what was it? House finch. There were two house finches in the road. One was laying down and one was sitting there. The one that was laying down was a male. The other one was female. The one that was laying down was dead. My assumption is that he had been killed. She was right there. She witnessed it, and she was, in human terms, coming to terms with it. I don't know that they actually have the close emotional bonds. Larger birds, parrots, they definitely do. House finches, probably don't have those strong emotional bonds that people do. But I moved the male onto the sidewalk so she wouldn't get hit too. But it is something to consider. In captivity, crows tend to form long-term, rather than saying they mate for life, they tend to form long-term pair bonds. Crows tend to also form close bonds with other mating pairs. So during the summertime, a mated pair will raise their chicks, but in the wintertime, this mated pair and their next door neighbors and their neighbors on the other side and a couple of houses down the way or a couple of nests down the way will all form a big flock and hang out together during the winter. In captivity situations, breeding pairs will sometimes break up. Sometimes this can be violent, with one partner trying to drive off their mate and saying, "This is my territory, you leave." And if they're in the same cage, there's nowhere for the other mate to go. This is particularly true if that pair has bred in the past, but for some reason they're not able to breed this year, like the owner has decided not to breed them and has not supplied them with a place to nest and material to build the nest, or has been taking the eggs out of there. So if you have a breeding pair and you decide not to breed them, they might need to be separated. Now, if you don't want to breed, we cannot spay and neuter birds. I say we cannot. Okay. We probably could, but it is a very high risk surgery and most vets will never do this. So when days get longer, like now, birds are starting to think about breeding season and they start getting ready to breed. You can see behavioral changes. They can start being problem birds. They're more likely to have behavior problems at this time of the year. They're all hormonal. You know, they're kind of like teenagers, only they have to go through it every year during the breeding season. So what do you do to prevent that? Well, if it's extremely difficult, if the bird is having a lot of behavior problems, if it's a female who is laying too many eggs, which is a strain on her body, you can sometimes treat them with hormones. Yeah. Oh, Rebecca got one and Fiona is coming up with the other. You can, the easy way is to maintain constant day length. And you can do this with things like covering the cage at night or having them sleep somewhere without windows. Maybe you've got a walk-in closet and you can put them in the closet and shut the door. Maintaining that constant day length keeps them from going into this hormonal breeding frenzy kind of thing. So yeah, that is important. That's why I put little stars here. In fact, oops. Put stars all over that. So you guys pay attention to that one. Okay. I'm going to clear this one more time. I've got a few more things to talk about while we're still looking at these cute lovebirds. Oops. We talked about genetics a little bit. Don't breed closely related birds. If you don't know, maybe don't breed. If you got them at PetSmart, they may be closely related. They may not. You don't know. So that's important. Does your bird have a genetic disease? You should know what is common in the species you are interested in breeding. Could they pass them on to offspring? Careful breeding reduces the risk of genetic disorders. Birds that are inbred, they have closely related parents, tend to have worse health. And so that's the genetics part of this. So the genetics is important. They should get vet checked for contagious diseases like sexually transmitted infections. There are sexually transmitted infections in birds, and general health. Okay. Screenshot. You need a large cage. For anything like cockatiels or conures or larger than that, it should be a cage big enough that you can get in it. That tells you it's going to be big enough for the, well, not for parrots, but that does give you an idea that it might be big enough there. Why do we not breed birds that are closely related? Okay, I can explain that again. Two individuals who are closely related, when you, let me back up. Everybody has genetic mutations. All birds have some genetic mutations. All people have some genetic mutations. You can have the genetic mutation for sickle cell anemia or Tay-Sachs disease and have no idea that you have that disease. Those are both recessive disorders. If you then sleep with your sibling, your brother or sister, and have kids, the chances that your brother or sister also have that same genetic mutation, Tay-Sachs or sickle cell, is significantly high. Much, much higher than if you went out and met a random stranger and decided to have babies with them. So the offspring are more likely to inherit these recessive mutations that, if you have 2 copies of it, can lead to disease. I hope that clears that up. Good. A lot of birds are cavity nesters, a lot of the birds that we have in captivity. So if you've got a parrot, you're going to need a wooden nest box. If you have a finch, you can use one of these woven nest boxes. You need access to the inside for cleaning. And they should be well cleaned between uses. So these nests like this, you can't clean. You just chuck them. A wooden box, you can take the old nest material out. You can bleach the interior and get it nice and clean before the next breeding season. Some birds are platform, or they build their nests on branches. So you'll need a platform or an artificial nest. So you can see this cup nest here. And you can have that as the basic building structure for their nests. If you have a large aviary, a lot of birds will nest in hanging baskets. So you can hang a plant. Now, if you hang a plant and birds nest in it, you may have to let the plant die because you don't want to get water on the babies or on the eggs. You want to keep it as dry as possible. Most birds are going to want to add their own nesting material. So, no thread or hair. Those can get wrapped around the baby's legs. And it can literally cut off the blood supply to the leg. You can use plain facial tissues. So not the ones with lotion in them, not any that have a fragrance or that are dyed to look pink or blue or whatever. Coconut fibers are pretty good. Broadleaf grasses, as long as you can get them from someplace that isn't using pesticides. Strips of paper, depending on your shredder. If your shredder makes long strings of paper, that's a good one. So that's the general rule for most bird species. Again, if you decide you want to breed, you got to do more research on your specific species. Okay, if you want a screenshot, now's your chance. Everybody say, "Aw." Okay. Ooh. All right. Females should not breed often. Even if you don't put nesting supplies in, Sometimes females will lay eggs and she'll just lay eggs on the bottom of the cage. You want to be careful about that. Egg laying reduces the calcium stores in the female's body. And if she doesn't have enough calcium, the eggs can be weak, her bones can get brittle, and she can have egg binding, which is where the egg gets stuck in her cloaca. Egg binding requires a vet, and it is an emergency. So if you see an egg sticking out of the bottom of your female bird's cloaca, and she doesn't lay it in like the next 15 minutes, you want to take her to a vet so that the vet can get it out of there. All right. When we're thinking about rearing the offspring, I've mentioned this before. There are two paths to go down. One is letting the parents do the work. Now, this is easier on you, but the more the young are handled, the more comfortable they'll be with people. Just like kittens, right? All 4 of my cats were feral born. And some of them got handled a lot more when they were kittens, and they're much, much more comfortable now. One of them, we completely missed that critical period when it was young, and he's just completely still feral. So you can get the same kinds of issues with birds. Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, I have 2 feral cats as well, and I've had them for 4 years, and I still can't pick them up. They missed that socialization period when they were young.
Yeah.
So I don't think I'll ever be able to pick them up.
Yeah. We have one who is 7. And in order to trim his nails and that sort of stuff, we literally have to catch him up in a towel once a month, trim his nails, and that is the only time we touch him. That's it. So right there with you. How long should it take a bird to lay an egg? Once she has started laying the egg, it should be very fast. Matter of minutes. At most like 15 or 20 minutes. Why should birds not lay eggs at the bottom of their cage? Well, part of that is sanitation, because where is the bird's poop? But also, if they're laying it on the bottom of the cage, it's an unplanned breeding. You didn't provide them with a nest. It's harder for them to keep the eggs warm. And then if the babies hatch, then they're on the bottom of the cage with all the bird poop. So that's really just not a great option. That said, there are some species that are ground nesters and will breed on the ground, but I haven't been covering those because they're not that common in the pet trade. Now, some birds will not tolerate you handling their babies. They will get really, really upset. But your scent will not cause parents to reject the offspring. Most birds have a relatively poor sense of smell. Just cause a nestling bird smells like a person, that will not cause the parents to reject it. What they will reject are cold nestlings. So the parent says, this baby's cold. It must be dying. I shouldn't waste my time and energy to try and raise it because it's just going to die anyway. And it might get the other chicks, the other nestling sick. So I'm just going to kick it out. This is true of wild birds as well. If you find a wild nestling on the ground, when we talk about wildlife rehab, we'll talk about what you should do, but don't be afraid to pick it up. If mom and dad are still around and they're going to take care of it, they're not going to smell it and reject it. If you warm it up and give it back, yes, the parents will accept it then. Yeah, so if you've been handling nestlings and they've gotten cold, if you can get them warm, you can give them back to the parents. How do you warm baby birds? My favorite way to warm baby birds is a rice bag. Incredibly simple to make. Take an old sock, put some rice in it, tie it closed, microwave it. You have to feel it to see how fast it gets warm in your microwave. It has the advantage over warm water in that if water cools off, if you forget and leave the warm water in with the baby, it will cool off and it will start to pull heat from the body of the baby. The rice bag will not do that. If it cools off, it never cools off below feeling like room temperature. And you can reuse rice bags over and over and over again. Okay. Quick screenshot so we can talk about hand rearing. All right. If you are planning to release a baby bird, you don't want to handle it any more than you have to. Birds that are in wildlife rehab may have to be hand fed. Those birds should be handled as little as possible. Wild birds that are given a lot of attention will often seek out humans after they've been released. So your grandma raised baby birds and released them. May have worked out back when the population density was low, but it may not have. A lot of these wild birds that are given this attention will seek out humans, and not all humans are going to be nice, especially if we're talking about something like a crow or a hawk or an owl, bigger birds that people tend to be scared of anyway. They can harm people, especially the hawks and owls. We all know what happens to so-called nuisance animals. We've already talked about that today. If, however, the bird is going to stay in captivity, then bonding with people is good. It will reduce their stress level for their entire life. It will improve the likelihood that whoever has them as a pet will keep them longer term because they can interact with them more. And it reduces the stress of vet visits. So if you are hand rearing, you may need an incubator to keep them warm. Just like everything else when you're handling birds needs to be cleaned regularly and really scrubbed between breeding seasons. If you are raising chicks and they are still nestlings, you will need to build a nest for them. Okay. Now, how do you do this with baby birds? If the nest does not provide them with enough support, they can have leg injuries. So how do we do this? You want to get a small container, like a small bowl. Smaller is better, as long as the baby fits in it. And then you can line it with plain tissues. Again, don't use the lotion tissues, or this is a surgical towel. You can use surgical towels, or baby blankets are really good to create a round shape for the baby bird to sit right in. Let's get a baby bird to sit in it. So you can see little Miss Hamilton sitting here in her little nest, nice and snug. Whatever you use, you want to make sure the nestling's feet can't get tangled in it and that it can be cleaned. Cleaned, 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 cleaned. Okay, I'm going to go on and talk about food. Did I not have another one? Okay. So what do you feed a baby bird? The most efficient way to feed a young nestling is a liquid diet. Using an eyedropper or dropper or a syringe without the needle. You really should be this really should be demonstrated to you before you try and do it on your own. You have to make sure the baby has time to swallow. And you need to also provide water. Even though it's a liquid diet, the liquid diets still don't quite have enough moisture in them. And so you should give the baby bird water a couple of times a day. Now, what is the liquid diet? Different species have different nutritional requirements. If you go to a pet store, you'll often find a dusty container on the shelf that says baby bird food or hand rearing formula. If it's dusty, it's probably been there too long. If it doesn't specify the type of bird, it's probably not a great choice. If you have something and you can find a species specific diet online, that is probably a good way to go. If your species has a pelleted diet available for it, you might be able to mash that up, moisten it, and use that to feed the nestlings. But you need to pick something that's species specific. Because what's good for a budgie is not going to be the same thing that's good for this macaw. As soon as possible. Once the baby gets a little bit bigger, the feathers are starting to come in. You can use tweezers to feed solid food. What am I talking about here? Mealworms soaked in vitamin water. I'm not a big fan of using vitamins with birds. They can very often get too much, but when we're talking about raising babies, this is one time where it is useful. Soaked pellets that are kind of mushy are good, and small pieces of fruit and veggie. When you are hand feeding the baby, have your bowl of food here, baby right next to it, so it sees that you're taking food from the bowl and taking it straight to the mouth. And that will teach it to start picking up some of that food. Now, it takes it a while to learn to feed itself, but that's seeing the parent, in this case you, picking up food to feed the baby is the first step in learning how to feed itself. Okay. Whew. I'm a little bit behind where I wanted to be today, but I'm going to clear this screen and go back to the announcements. So for the late people, Tuesday, no lecture. I want you to watch the video called Parrot Confidential. The link is going to be up on Blackboard in just a few minutes. I will, not today, but before Monday, post a quick quiz on the video to confirm that you watched it. Mary, yeah.
Are you going to put up Tuesday's lecture and today's lecture today too?
I will start on that.
Okay.
Yep. YouTube sometimes gets jammed up and it can be slow. This you can watch anytime, yes. I am giving you the class period off so that if you're incredibly, insanely busy, you have this time that you normally wouldn't. And we will meet again next Thursday to talk about parrots. Are there any other questions? If not, I will see everybody next week. Have a good weekend, guys.